I think Pete Hegseth wants to get fired so he can go back to drinking every night. I'm joking, but honestly, at this point, I'm not. The only hole in that theory is the fact that Pete Hegseth has probably been drinking this entire time, considering that his tenure as Secretary of Defense has been scandal after scandal, screw up after screw up, and leak after leak. But this time, Pete Hegseth was creating chaos, not with a leak, but with a straight up admission and an attack on Stephen Miller to his wife. It was a crazy meltdown that we are going to get into. But before we do, if I could quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button, because it goes a long way in supporting our work. Now, before we get into how Hegseth attacked Stephen Miller to his wife's face for some reason, I guess he just hates his job and anyone having respect for him, which no one does at this point. I want to start with the latest hot water that Hegseth is in, because the news just keeps breaking. It's pretty bad for Pete Hegseth.
It's a day that ends in the letter Y. It is another scandal day engulfing Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Or at least that's what it feels like this week, but hey, it's only Wednesday. On Monday, Hegseth, with the help of White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, attempted to throw Admiral Frank Bradley under the bus, saying he's the individual responsible for the highly controversial double-tap boat strikes in the Caribbean on September 2nd. Which lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and lawyers and experts believe may have constituted a war crime. Yesterday, Pete Hegseth at Donald Trump's cabinet meeting seemed to endeavor to further embarrass himself, with Hegseth claiming, hey, I wasn't even in the room for that second boat strike, which was not exactly the impression he left with his former colleagues at Fox News when he went on their airwaves the day after the strike took place.
That was definitely not artificial intelligence. I watched it live. We knew exactly who was in that boat. We knew exactly what they were doing, and we knew exactly who they represented. And that was Tren de Aragua, a narco-terrorist organization designated by the United States, trying to poison our country with illicit drugs.
Brings us to today, almost a full circle moment for Pete Hegseth and the Trump White House. The initial massive scandal, which embarrassed the country and Donald Trump and his national security team, Signalgate. It was a massive national security breach. It was made possible entirely by the sloppy and haphazard nature of Donald Trump's national security team when they shared national security information, including war plans. And then former National Security Advisor Michael Waltz accidentally added Jeffrey Goldberg, a journalist from The Atlantic, to that group chat on Signal. A damning new report is being released from the Pentagon's Inspector General. That is the top watchdog at the building that Hegseth is in charge of running. That report says that Pete Hegseth shared information in that Signal chat, information that put mission operations and servicemen and women at risk about a pending military operation in Yemen that took place in March of this year. The Defense Department's Inspector General finds that while the mission ultimately was not jeopardized, Pete Hegseth violated his department's own policies when he used Signal, a commercial messaging app that is not approved for sharing classified information. The Inspector General's report, scheduled to be published on Thursday, was described to The Atlantic by numerous U.S. officials familiar with its findings. Now, while that controversy ultimately led to Michael Waltz being removed from his position as Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Pete Hegseth and the White House have maintained that he did nothing wrong. The Pentagon's chief spokesperson today called the Inspector General report a total exoneration of Hegseth. It's important to remember that if anybody did this who was not named Pete Hegseth, like any of the men and women farther down the chain of command, those men and women would be thrown out of the military and almost certainly face criminal prosecution.
Pete Hegseth is the most embarrassing figure in Donald Trump's administration, which is a crazy accomplishment to have, considering that Pam Bondi exists, that Kash Patel exists. Scott Bessent is regularly getting into physical brawls with members of the Trump administration, and somehow Pete Hegseth has beaten them all out. The idiocy is top-notch. If he could distill it down, he would, and then he would drink it because it is a proof that I really can't even imagine at this point. Yeah, Pete Hegseth seems to want to be involved in scandals. It is literally the only explanation, and I mean literally the only explanation for why. While he was on Katie Miller's podcast, Stephen Miller's wife, which, first of all, time out. Why does Katie Miller still have a podcast? Why is she on CNN? Why is anyone platforming this lunatic? She's not even a good communicator. But while he was on Katie Miller's podcast, which shouldn't exist, he decided to blurt out this attack on her husband. Pentagon Pete says he wouldn't let Stephen Miller babysit his kids. Pete Hegseth has said he would never let Stephen Miller babysit his children, an awkward comment made even more cringeworthy by who he said it to. Miller's wife, the Secretary of Defense, made the comments on the Katie Miller podcast when she asked him, "Who would you trust to babysit your kids?" clarifying that it had to be another member of the cabinet. Instead of immediately saying who he would trust, Hegseth opted to point out who in the cabinet and wider Trump world he wouldn't trust. I mean, not your husband or Marco, Hegseth responded, referring to White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Miller is not a member of the cabinet, though. That idiotic comment by Pete Hegseth, to me, reveals so much. First of all, Katie Miller shouldn't have a podcast. That's obvious. Stephen Miller isn't in the cabinet. And so the fact that Pete Hegseth refers to him as if he is shows the type of involvement that Stephen Miller has in the day-to-day of the White House. I also think that it is funny that the people closest to Donald Trump, obviously Stephen Miller, but on the topic of the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which Pete Hegseth has been largely cut out of in exchange for another high-ranking official at the Pentagon, the Army Secretary Driscoll. Pete Hegseth has been boxed out of that. For him to just blurt out that he is furious with Stephen Miller and Marco Rubio, who is cutting him out of this negotiation because he's such a drunk idiot that Trump doesn't even want him involved in this, something that Trump obviously doesn't care about, these negotiations to end a war that Trump promised would already be over, by the way. Pete Hegseth is furious at Stephen Miller. Why else would he say that? It's not charming to be like, oh, your husband, he sucks and would be a bad father and caretaker. That's not like a funny ha-ha. Pete Hegseth is a monumental idiot. And may we return to the fact that Katie Miller shouldn't have a podcast. I think our channel actually gets it may be close to 1 million times the views of Katie Miller's podcast. I'm serious with y'all. I think last month we hit about, and this is all because of you, thank you, about 70 million views. I think if you go look at any given Katie Miller video, it's going to be 100 views. So we might be outperforming her on the charts, but this is embarrassing. Not just Katie Miller, but the Hegseth of it all. And I am obviously not the only one who agrees, because so did Ruben Gallego, who ripped them apart.
Well, I didn't need the Inspector General's report to tell me and to tell the country what Secretary of Defense Hegseth was dangerous and put his men in danger. It's not that hard to figure out. Well, if you're sharing time, location, ordnance, and potential targets, where are the particular trajectories that some of these planes could be coming from, and the timing. And the fact that Secretary Hegseth couldn't admit that he made a mistake and then try to go back and say, well, it's not classified. It doesn't matter if it's classified or declassified at any point. The fact is that you shared information in such a dangerous way that you could have compromised the mission and compromised men and women, all to appease his little fragile soul, because he's just trying to make up for the fact that he is way over his head and he's just a TV show host pretending to be the Secretary of Defense.
When you see this IG report findings start to seep out, the full report will be released on Thursday, and you see the White House for at least the 3 days that we've all lived through together of this week, very publicly and rather brazenly blaming Admiral Bradley for the strike that is under scrutiny. What do you think the men and women of the military are feeling right now about their Secretary of Defense and Commander-in-Chief?
Well, the men and women of the military, the professionals that we still rely on, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and I have heard that they are just not exactly trusting the leadership of this man. They think that he is a joke and that he's effectively using our military to help him and help in whatever goal he has. And, we were very clear, and you've seen the story change this whole week, but many of us that serve the military said what they did off the coast of Venezuela was an illegal act. You should not double tap. That's what we call in the military. People that are no longer in combat, no longer eluding, and the fact that he first bragged about it but then backed off from it and now throwing someone else on the bus shows you that this man is not ready for the job. He's not ready to be Secretary of Defense, and he is potentially putting our national defense at danger.
It's been explained a couple times on this show, and I keep underscoring it because it feels important, that the manual that the military trains from to understand where the line is morally and ethically includes this example of a shipwrecked person on a vessel that's been struck. As that is an example, that is not an example, that is the example of where the line lies. And that once someone is shipwrecked, they're rendered defenseless, and so they must be rescued. What do you know about Admiral Bradley that squares in your mind with why someone who was one of the first to deploy to Afghanistan after September 11th, someone whose record, at least that's public facing, is sterling? How do you think someone with that much experience goes on to violate the exact example that's in the military's own war manual in terms of the thing that you don't do?
Listen, this admiral has a lot more experience in combat than I had. It's an infantryman for the Marines in Iraq. We saw a lot of combat, but this guy knows and has seen a lot more. And he's faced this same scenario, I bet, just as often as I have in a personal capacity. And it is tough. It is tough to be in combat and then have to render aid to the terrorists that were just trying to kill you. But we did it in Iraq. And whatever happened, whatever these men and women that were in these boats, whether they were narcos, whether they were cartels, or whether they were fishermen, the reason you stop after they are no longer eluding you, after they are no longer a threat, is to give it a time and an assessment for, number one, to actually take in information. Maybe we now discover that they are not actually transporting drugs.
How could you not be embarrassed by this guy? I am. Everybody in the country should be, and probably is. When you appoint and confirm a Fox News cabinet, you are going to get Fox News results. And while they are often entertaining to Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone, it puts the rest of us in danger. And as Fox knows from lying about the 2020 election, it costs you a shit ton of money and legal trouble. That is what Donald Trump and this administration are facing down, and they will continue to as we continue to call them out. It is why I'm going to do so every day on this show, and if you want to support that and be a part of it, as always, you can hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video. If you stuck around at the end, drop a blue heart in the comments. Keep on fighting, y'all. Don't let them silence you. Until next time, I'll see you soon.